On July 24th, Anthropic did something they've now done 4 times in under 2 months. They shipped another frontier model. This time it was Opus, Claude Opus 5. And within days, the internet was flooded with a wave of benchmark screenshots, review threads, and hot takes about whether this is the model that finally closes the gap at the top of the leaderboard. Last time on this channel, we lined every major model up side by side and mapped out exactly where the frontier stood. Consider this the sequel, because the frontier just moved again, and this time the story isn't just about raw power. It's about something Anthropic is betting the entire release on: control. Let's set the scene first, because the timeline here matters more than people are giving it credit for. In June, Anthropic dropped Sonnet 5. Then came Mythos 5. Then Fable 5, their most capable and most expensive model, the one everyone assumed would be the ceiling for a while. And now, barely weeks later, Opus 5 lands as the 4th Claude 5 family release inside 2 months. That is not a cadence, that is a sprint. And it tells you something about where this entire industry has landed in 2026. Nobody is waiting for the one big blockbuster drop anymore. Everybody is iterating in public, in real time, and shipping the moment something is ready. OpenAI did the same thing with GPT 5.6 just 2 weeks before this, on July 9th. The blockbuster era is over. Welcome to the iteration era. So what actually shipped on the 24th? On paper, Opus 5 looks almost boring. Same pricing as its predecessor, Opus 4.8. $5 per million input tokens, $25 per million output tokens, no change there. But pricing parity while the model underneath gets meaningfully stronger is exactly the play. Anthropic isn't trying to win by being the most expensive option on the table anymore. They're trying to win by making their mid-tier flagship punch into territory that used to require their top-tier model, Fable 5, and the price tag that comes with it. And that brings us to the feature everyone is actually talking about: the effort dial. Opus 5 lets you choose low, medium, or high effort on a given task, and you can switch mid-conversation without losing your cached context. Think about what that actually means in practice. You're not locked into paying frontier prices for a task that only needed a quick answer, and you're not stuck with a lightweight response when the problem in front of you actually deserves the model's full attention. You dial it up or down as the task demands, inside the same thread, without starting over. Anthropic also quietly shipped 2 beta features alongside this: mid-conversation tool changes that don't blow away your prompt cache, and automatic fallback routing, so if a request gets flagged by a safety classifier, it reroutes instead of just failing outright. Small things. But small things that add up to a model built for people who actually run this in production every day, not just people chasing a leaderboard screenshot. Think about what the effort dial actually looks like in a real workday. You're drafting a quick summary email, low effort is plenty, it's fast and it's cheap, and you never think about it again. 20 minutes later, you're debugging a multi-step agent workflow that touches 4 different tools and needs to reason through edge cases you didn't anticipate. You push the same conversation up to high effort, right there in the thread, and the model reallocates its compute to match. No new session, no lost context, no re-explaining what you're working on. That's the actual shift here. Model selection used to be a decision you made once, at the start of a task, by picking which product tier or which model name to open. Now it's a dial you can turn mid-conversation, which sounds like a small UX change until you realize how much wasted spend and wasted context switching it quietly eliminates. Now let's get into the benchmarks, because this is where the hype train really left the station. On Frontier Bench version 0.1, Anthropic claims Opus 5 more than doubles the score their previous Opus model put up. On ArcAGI 3, the claim is roughly 3 times the next best model's result. On the Zapier Automation Bench, a benchmark built specifically around real-world tool use and workflow automation, Opus 5 is claiming a pass rate around 1.5 times the next closest competitor. And on the science side, this is where it gets genuinely interesting for anyone doing research work. Organic chemistry tasks jumped over 10 points compared to Opus 4.8. Protein analysis tasks jumped nearly 8 points. This is a model that Anthropic is clearly positioning as a serious tool for scientific and biological research, not just code generation and chat. But the number that's driving the most conversation is the comparison against Fable 5 itself, Anthropic's own top-tier model. On OSWorld 2.0, a benchmark for autonomous computer use, Opus 5 actually surpasses Fable 5, and does it at roughly 1/3 the cost. On CursorBench 3.2, running at maximum effort, Opus 5 lands within 0.5% of Fable 5's peak score, again at half the price. Read that again. Anthropic's mid-tier model is nipping at the heels of their flagship on some of the exact benchmarks that flagship was built to dominate. That is the headline. That is why this launch is generating a wave of reviews instead of a shrug. Here's where we do what this channel always does. We put the brakes on the hype for a second and give you the honest version, because that's the version that actually holds up. Every single one of those numbers you just heard is vendor run. Anthropic ran these benchmarks themselves, published the results themselves, and as of this recording, none of them have been independently reproduced by a third party. That doesn't mean they're wrong. Anthropic has a real track record of benchmark claims holding up reasonably well once outside labs get their hands on the model. But it does mean you should treat these specific numbers as a starting claim, not a verified conclusion. Notice too that most of these results are framed as ratios and multipliers. 3 times this, 1.5 times that. Rather than raw absolute scores you could sanity check against a public leaderboard yourself. Ratios are easier to make sound dramatic than raw numbers are, and that's worth keeping in the back of your mind every time a lab drops a benchmark chart on launch day. And one more thing worth sitting with before we move on. Every one of these benchmarks is only as meaningful as the task it's actually simulating. A 3 times jump on Eris AGI 3 tells you something about abstract reasoning on puzzle-style problems. It does not automatically tell you the model will be 3 times better at your actual job. A benchmark score is a proxy, not a guarantee, and the gap between an impressive chart and an impressive real-world result is exactly where a lot of channels lose credibility by skipping straight from one to the other. We're not going to do that here. There's also a more pointed caveat buried in the fine print, and it's actually the most reassuring part of this whole release if you think about it the right way. On cybersecurity exploitation tasks and autonomous biology research tasks, Opus 5 actually scores behind Mythos 5, the model Anthropic released back in June. At first glance that reads like a weakness, but look at what those two categories actually are. Offensive security exploitation and autonomous bioresearch are exactly the categories where you do not want your everyday, cheaply priced, mass-deployed model to be maximally capable. Anthropic is explicitly calling Opus 5 their most aligned Opus model yet, and the least susceptible to being tricked into misuse, with stronger cybersecurity guardrails than Opus 4.8 had. A model that's slightly weaker specifically in the categories tied to real-world harm, while getting stronger everywhere else, is not a bug. That's a company making a deliberate trade-off, and it's the kind of trade-off this channel is always going to call out when we see it, because it's the difference between hype that's just marketing and hype that's actually earned. So where does this leave the model comparison landscape we mapped out last time? Opus 5 is now the default model on Claude Max and the strongest option available on Claude Pro, which tells you exactly who Anthropic built this for. Not researchers chasing the absolute frontier at any cost. That's still Fable 5's job. Opus 5 is for the enterprise teams, the working developers, and the power users who need something that behaves like a frontier model most of the time, without frontier model pricing every single time. Stack it against GPT 5.6, which shipped just 2 weeks earlier chasing a similar economical strategy, and you can see the entire industry converging on the same idea at almost the same moment. The next competitive edge isn't just raw intelligence anymore. It's intelligence you can actually afford to run at scale, with a dial you control. If you're building anything right now, here's the practical takeaway. For quick, high-volume tasks, drop the effort dial down and let Sonnet tier pricing logic do the work. For anything that actually needs deep reasoning, multi-step tool use, or research-grade output, push Opus 5 up to high effort before you reach for Fable 5's price tag, because on several of the benchmarks that matter most for real workflows, the gap between them is now razor-thin. Keep Fable 5 in your back pocket for the tasks where you genuinely need the absolute ceiling, and nothing less will do. 4 models in under 2 months, a pricing model that stayed flat while the capability curve bent upward. A dial that puts cost control directly in your hands instead of forcing you into one fixed tier. That's the real story buried underneath the benchmark headlines this week. The frontier didn't just move on July 24th, the way we're all going to interact with it moved too. That's the full breakdown of the Opus 5 launch and everything underneath the benchmark wave. If you want the next installment of this series the moment the frontier shifts again, you know exactly what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.